Hello Revolution students, and welcome back to another video on the Chinese Revolution area of study 2. In this video I'm going to look at the Great Leap Forward, which began in May 1958 and continued through to 1961. To understand why the Great Leap Forward was launched, we need to go back a little bit and have a review of the first 5-year plan and the results of the first 5-year plan. So I remind you that the big focus of the first 5-year plan was the development of industry, and in particular heavy industry. And the consequences of the first 5-year plan for society in general was, firstly, it was a big success. It did result in industrial growth and industrial development, on average about 10 to 16% annual growth. And it also benefited in particular those people who lived in the urban areas, the workers and the intellectuals, and they benefited from higher wages, and with these higher wages also greater access to education for their children. So huge benefits for people who lived in the cities. However, for the people in the countryside, the peasants, they did not benefit from the first 5-year plan. Their wages remained stagnant, and the educational opportunities for their children did not increase. Mao Zedong was fully aware of this, and this is one of the major reasons why he launched the Great Leap Forward, because he wanted to raise the wealth of the peasants compared to that of the workers, and he wanted to make sure that the peasants could, for example, allow their children to have greater access to educational opportunities as well. So this is one of the big driving reasons behind the launch of the Great Leap Forward. There are a few other sort of contributing factors as well. Mao's infatuation with collectivization, and his belief that it hadn't been effectively implemented during the first 5-year plan, and he believed it could be implemented better by the party itself. So this was another reason for the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward resulted in the famine, which we're going to look at in a sec, and one of the contributing factors to the famine and the failed policies that caused this famine was the fear of people within China to question the CCP and Mao Zedong after what had occurred previously during, for example, the thought reform campaigns in the Sanfan and the Wufan, where critics were sent out, or class enemies, reactionaries, were sent to Laogai, the labour camps, to be rectified through harsh labour. But we'll get to that in a sec. So anyway, let's have a look. Let's go through an overview of the Great Leap Forward. So it was launched at the 8th Party Congress, which ran from the 5th to the 23rd of May 1958. And as I said before, its aim was to develop the rural economy after the lack of development during the first 5-year plan. And connecting into what I said before about collectivization, so one of the major reforms that occurred during the Great Leap Forward was the establishment of communes, which were in effect big or huge cooperatives. So you can see there, by the end of 1958, 740,000 agricultural cooperatives were reorganised into 26,000 people's communes. They were bigger than cooperatives, and the communes averaged around 5,000 households with populations up to 100,000 people. And Mao believed that these communes would boost agricultural production. He was a big believer in collectivization. I remind you, Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, they believed collectivization didn't work, as demonstrated by the results during the first 5-year plan. Mao Zedong believed that collectivization did work, but that it wasn't implemented effectively enough by CCP cadres during the first 5-year plan. He believed it was going to work this time. So failed policies and the practices of the GLF, and this is the big consequence of the Great Leap Forward. It led to a massive famine, which we're going to look at in a second. Now, it was clear quite early on that these communes and collectivization, they were not working. They were not leading to a huge increase in agricultural production. You can see that even by July 1959, many leaders within the CCP and CCP members recognised that the collectivisation wasn't working, the communes weren't working, because many of them, Liu Shaoqi, Peng Dewei, you can see there, they went out into the countryside and actually saw for themselves that people were starting to starve. After Peng had done his tour of the countryside, he came back to the Lushan Plenum in July 1959, and at this conference he criticised the policies of the Great Leap Forward because he said they were not working, people were starving, and he also criticised Mao Zedong. He tried to stop this policy, these policies, which we're going to look at in a second later detail, in more detail. But rather than listening to him, Mao Zedong and the CCP, Mao Zedong got the CCP to attack him and condemn him, as you can see there, an anti-party element. After this, there was no one in the CCP who was prepared to stand up to Mao Zedong and try to stop the GLF. And as a consequence, these failed policies continued for another 2 years, leading to a massive famine. And let's have a look. Actually, before we do have a look at the policies in greater detail, let me just have I just got a extract from, and I'll open it up here, an extract from Mao's first speech at the 8th Party Conference launching the Great Leap Forward. And he said, "The rural areas have made a great leap forward. After the rectification, the anti-rightist movement, cadre participation in labour and worker participation in a part of the management, the urban and rural political atmosphere has changed." So what he is alluding to there, the rectification and the anti-rightist movement, I remind you, are related to the 100 Flowers campaign. And he's saying, and he's sort of linking that, I think, back to the first 5-year plan as well, where he argued the CCP cadres weren't implementing collectivisation effectively enough because of their just general lack of revolutionary attitude or vigour or fervour. And he's saying here, after the 100 Flowers campaign, their attitudes had changed, and as a result, this time, during the Great Leap Forward, the collectivisation policies would be implemented effectively. One can say that the agricultural pessimism and hopelessness and the lack of confidence in realising the 40 articles have been swept clean. However, some of the tide watchers and fall account settlers have not been swept clean. Therefore, attention must be given to this work. So he's saying there's still some people within the party who doubt the effectiveness of collectivisation, and to be on the lookout for them. Okay, let's have a look at these policies that led to the famine. So turning over. Failed policies and practices of the GLF. So the first one was the backyard steel mills. And this is when all these backyard steel mills were built out in the countryside. Their aim was to produce huge amounts of steel in order to overtake Britain's steel production, because Mao had, at the start or just prior to the Great Leap Forward, set China's aim to produce more than Britain in steel production. So the peasants started building these backyard steel mills, and the big consequence for the Great Leap Forward was that it took them away, because they spent days and nights building these steel mills and melting down steel and so forth. It took them away from the fields, so they couldn't plant as much, they couldn't grow as much rice and wheat, and as a consequence, agricultural production dropped. Another failed policy or practice were these communal kitchens. So in the communes, communal kitchens were set up. People no longer ate in their own homes. They ate in these communal kitchens, and in the first year, There were huge meals and people ate really well, but they ate all their food reserves, and they even before they could restock them. So by the latter years, they did not have enough to eat. They had not left any food in storage for these latter years. And the third failed policy or practice was Lysenkoism. So Lysenko was a Russian Soviet agricultural scientist, and he came up with two theories. The one was called close planting and the second was deep ploughing. Mao Zedong and the CCP, they thought these theories sounded really good, so they implemented them in China. Close planting was when plants, be they rice or wheat, were planted very closely together in a field, in the belief that the more that you planted within the field, the more that would grow, and the greater the agricultural production per field. However, what resulted instead was poor quality and reduced yields, because when these plants were planted so closely together, wind couldn't go through them, and it actually caused disease. So, and as a consequence, there was poor quality and reduced yields. The second policy was this deep ploughing, and this is when the Chinese farmers, they dug deep down into the soil, even a couple of meters deep, in the belief that, you know, this soil deep under the ground would be a lot more fertile than the soil on top. So they dug this up, but what they found, they brought this deep soil up to the top, onto the surface of the fields, but it was not more fertile. The fertility was in the top soil itself. As a consequence, when they tried to grow different crops in this soil, the crops did not produce any more. They actually produced less. So this was another reason of a drop in agricultural production. The fourth failed policy was the four pests. So the killing of sparrows, mice, flies, and mosquitoes. The big one was the killing of the sparrows, and because sparrows were a natural predator of locusts, and all the sparrows died because the Chinese killed them in China, there were huge locust plagues, so locusts ran riot. So these four policies, along with the fifth here, contributed to the famine. And the fifth one was this manipulation of statistics. And this occurred when CCP cadres who ran the communes inflated or said that they actually produced more grain than they actually did. So they sent these, and they did this in order to ingratiate themselves with their superiors in Beijing and get promotions and the like. So they sent their stats to the government, and the government believed that more grain was produced than actually was, and then they ordered the communes to send all this grain to them because the government believed that the communes had extra grain. They sent this extra grain overseas to places like Albania, North Korea, and Vietnam. As a consequence, though, the peasants in the communes did not have enough to eat. So in 1958 it was reported, and here's your key stats here. So in 1958 it was reported agricultural output was 450 million tonnes, when the actual output was 200 million tonnes. By 1959 the reported agricultural output was 500 million tonnes, when the actual output was 170 million tonnes. So all of this grain was getting taken from the communes when people were starving. And these policies, along with droughts that affected China at this time, in 59, 60, 61, contributed to the 3 bad years. And you can see there, so the above policies, along with drought, caused a mass famine. Now there are various figures about, or estimates about, how many people died during the 3 bad years in China. Probably the best one to use is by Jasper Becker, because he's like the authority on this subject, and he estimates that 30 million people died in China during this time. So that's the major consequence of the Great Leap Forward, the 3 bad years, the biggest famine pretty much in human history. Another consequence, though, was that the famine and the policies themselves bred corruption amongst provincial officials, these CCP cadres who ran these communes, and they used their positions to benefit themselves and their families, leading to bureaucratisation. And this then flows into, it's a contributing factor to the Cultural Revolution, we'll see, because Mao's fully aware, and the other CCP leaders as well, Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, they're aware of this corruption amongst provincial officials and CCP cadres. They try to weed it out, but they're not that effective at doing it. And it is one reason why Mao Zedong launches the great proletarian cultural revolution. The final consequence, significant consequence of the Great Leap Forward, was that at the 7,000 Parties Conference in January 1962, Mao offered self-criticism, and he actually stepped back. He accepted responsibility for the failures of the Great Leap Forward, and he stepped back from the leadership, and he left it to Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping to fix the famine. Okay, he left Beijing and he went to Hangzhou, which is a resort city sort of southwest of Shanghai, located on the famous West Lake. All right, so that is our consequences of the Great Leap Forward. Let's have a look now at some historical interpretations. And the first one is by Morris Meisner, and he writes, Mao Zedong quite clearly must bear the largest share of the moral and historical responsibility for the Great Famine. He was the principal author of the Great Leap and its main producer. And in the fall of 1959, he personally insisted on resurrecting the failed movement when every rational calculation of what would serve the welfare and indeed the survival of the people counselled that the adventure be abandoned. There is no need to invoke the Maoist vision to explain this final folly. It was prompted by the most mundane and petty of egoistic political motives. We might say there his belief in the effectiveness of collectivization and his need to win the argument against Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping that collectivization did work. However severe the historical judgment on Mao's role in the Great Leap must be, it does not follow that he stands condemned as a mass murderer, no different from Hitler and Stalin, as some glibly portray him. Mao did not launch the Great Leap Forward with the aim of killing off a portion of the peasantry, as Stalin ordered his henchmen to liquidate the kulaks as a class, or Hitler devised and implemented the final solution and the Holocaust. So, what Meisner is arguing here is that yes, Mao Zedong is fully responsible for the famine. However, he did not set out to kill millions of people at the start, okay? He didn't set out to kill millions of the people at the start. That was a consequence of his policies. He did keep it over. He did keep the policies going though, when he was aware, even when he was aware that people were dying. And our second historical interpretation is from Jun Chang and John Halliday, and they write, "This was the greatest famine of the 20th century and of all recorded human history. Mao knowingly starved and worked these tens of millions of people to death. Mao had actually allowed for many more deaths. Although slaughter was not his purpose with the leap, he was more than ready for myriad deaths to result, and had hinted to his top echelon that they should not be too shocked if they happened." So Jung Chang and John Halliday have a slightly different take on Mao Zedong's, I suppose, responsibility for the famine. So yes, he worked tens of millions of people to death, but they're arguing he was also, I suppose, prepared from the start that some people might die, that many people might die as a consequence of the Great Leap Forward, and he was fully prepared for that. So that's our two historical interpretations on the Great Leap Forward. I hope you have found this video useful for your study of the Chinese Revolution Area Study 2, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.